Oh, you joined me. Hold on a sec. Let me get the light. There we go. Yes, I was just sitting here in the dark, waiting. Not creepy at all. Glad you made it. Take a few seconds to get comfy and maybe grab your favorite John Stamos body pillow and assume the big spoon position. How about we put a little burning fireplace in that bottom right corner for some ambient noise? Fireplace, please. Guys, the fireplace. There it is, splendid. Hard to find good help these days. Wait, that is much too large. Smaller, please, and in the corner. Good. Now how about some embers? Embers, please. Very good. Looks like we are all set for this monumental journey now. But first, if you would not mind liking and subscribing. It really helps us out more than you know. And drop a comment on what country you reside in, as we are always curious on where our viewers are from. Now, let's begin. When people think about medieval life, it's easy to get distracted by the shiny armor, the galloping horses, or the occasional roast pig turning over an open flame. You know, the stuff of Renaissance fairs and fantasy movies. But for most people living in that era, especially peasants, winter was less about heroic quests and more about a relentless, bitter slog just to make it to spring without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. Winter wasn't simply a season, it was a returning villain in a story where the heroes had straw beds, goat-scented cloaks, and zero plot armor. Every year, like clockwork, it arrived to test their willpower and fleece supply. Imagine a teacher who shows up every winter, cold-hearted and utterly unforgiving, doling out lessons in frostbite, fire maintenance, and the joys of group huddling with livestock. Your average medieval home wasn't exactly featured in Architectural Digest. Picture a single-room hut made of mud, sticks, and high hopes, more compost pile than cottage. The walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor sneeze through them, from a mile away. Windows, if they existed at all, were small holes stuffed with whatever you could find, goat hide, old rags, or just your sense of optimism. And let's not even talk about insulation, because it didn't exist. Temperature control? Not unless you count yelling at your cousin to move closer to the fire or plugging up a draft with a screaming chicken. The air indoors was usually just a few polite degrees, warmer than the Arctic gale blowing outside. If it was snowing in the forest, you were shivering by the hearth, and not in a cozy, cocoa-sipping kind of way. Nightfall was its own kind of nightmare. Once the sun went down, which it did at around 4 p.m., you were plunged into a world of shadow, howling wind, and the dim orange flicker of your barely there fire. That fire, by the way, was trying its hardest, bless it. But if you weren't the lucky soul sitting closest to it, your toes were already planning a getaway. The rest of the room? May as well have been Antarctica, but with fewer penguins and more coughing. Clothing offered limited relief. You had scratchy wool tunics, often damp, sometimes goat-scented, and almost always full of holes. Layering was less about fashion and more about sheer desperation. Cloaks? If you had one, congratulations. You were probably the envy of the entire village. If not, you were stuck piling on tunics until you resembled a very itchy onion. Sleeping arrangements didn't offer much comfort either. If you had a bed, it was likely a wooden frame with a sack of straw masquerading as a mattress. No memory foam. No quilts stitched with love. Just a crunchy, mildly pokey pile of dried plants that often doubled as a flea motel. Tossing and turning wasn't about getting comfy, it was about rotating limbs so none of them froze solid. The real MVP of medieval winter survival, the hearth. Not to be confused with a proper fireplace. Most peasant homes had a sunken fire pit or maybe a pile of stones on the floor, and that was it. No chimney, no vent, just smoke doing its best to exit the room, sometimes through the thatch, sometimes directly into your lungs. It was like living inside a smoked ham, except less tasty. Smoke inhalation may have been bad for your lungs, but on the plus side, it helped keep the fleas and mice in check. Win-win. People gathered around the hearth not just for warmth, but for entertainment. With no Netflix or TikTok, you stared at flames, told stories, sang songs, or just blinked slowly at the wall until bedtime. Letting the fire die out overnight was a rookie mistake. If it went cold, so did you, and relighting it wasn't as simple as striking a match. You had to coax sparks from flint and steel, pray to whatever saint handled fire starting, and hope your fingers weren't too frozen to hold the kindling. That's why families developed the art of fire banking, covering the coals with ash to keep them alive till morning. Done right, it saved lives. Done wrong, well, enjoy your icy breakfast. Fire banking was serious business. Everyone had their own technique. Some swore by dry ash, others insisted damp was better. Arguments over fire technique were the medieval version of today's barbecue debates, but instead of who made the best ribs, it was about who could keep their fire alive longest without waking up as a medieval popsicle. Beds? Let's talk more about those glorious straw sacks. If you were lucky, someone had tossed a few herbs into the rushes, lavender, rosemary, or mint, to cover the scent of mold, mildew, and whatever the chickens left behind. But by the third week, your mattress was mostly bugs and regret. Cleaning it meant chucking out all the old straw and replacing it, which was done rarely, partly out of laziness, partly because who had the extra straw? Then there was communal sleeping. Picture the entire family, grandparents, parents, kids, the neighbor's goat, all snuggled into one bed or a shared pile of cloth and hay. You didn't sleep so much as survive in a tangle of elbows and frozen noses. If you were lucky, you got the middle spot where warmth pooled. If you ended up on the edge, you were basically in the freezer section. Add in livestock sleeping indoors for extra warmth, and you had a full sensory experience, sounds, smells, and the occasional surprise hoof to the ribs. But hey, when it's you versus hypothermia, you don't complain about a pig snoring in your ear. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't clean, but it worked most of the time. The wind slicing through the walls wasn't bad enough. Medieval peasants also had to contend with a particularly sneaky enemy, the floor. And not just any floor, a solid, frozen, unforgiving slab of dirt pretending to be domestic. Floors back then weren't built so much as reluctantly accepted. Maybe, if you were lucky, someone flattened a bit of the earth inside the hut. But insulation, carpeting, not unless you consider last month's hay a design choice. The cold didn't just come from the sky, it rose like a ghost from the very bones of the earth. It snuck up through your boots into your legs and tried to stage a full-body mutiny by bedtime. If you dropped something at night, congratulations. It was now part of the permafrost. The floor quite literally claimed it. To combat this creeping chill, peasants laid down straw or dried rushes, if they could afford it. More often, if they could sneak enough from the neighbor's field without getting caught. The result? A slightly crunchier, mildly warmer surface to shuffle across, but straw flattened fast, molded faster, and added a crispy soundtrack to your every move. Layer enough of it and your house started to sound like a haunted granola bar. Rushes weren't much better. They decayed slowly, developed personalities, and eventually evolved into something resembling a swampy biodome of fleas, mold, and small rodents with squatters' rights. Some folks would throw new rushes on top of the old ones, repeatedly, until the pile of rotting plant matter began to resemble medieval carpeting, if your idea of carpet is a damp, smelly haystack sprinkled with bugs. Beds didn't offer a reprieve. If you were lucky enough to have one, it was likely just a wooden frame filled with, you guessed it, more straw. And not the fresh kind. These mattresses poked, itched, and creaked like they held ancient secrets. And those secrets probably involved lice. Sleep was more of a defensive posture than a restful experience. You twisted and turned not out of comfort, but to keep your limbs from freezing off. Still, survival is the mother of invention, and peasants weren't pushovers. They got creative. Drafts were sealed with anything vaguely squishy: moss, wool scraps, old tunics, and, if push came to shove, parts of last year's goat, gaps in the walls plugged with mud, leaky roofs stuffed with turf, rags, or a sense of impending doom. Windows, if they existed, were jokes, tiny holes in the wall covered with thin skins or planks. Glass. That was a luxury item. Even the lord of the manor might have had just one pane, and he probably bragged about it. For everyone else, a cowhide flap would do, until the wind ripped it off mid-blizzard and flung it into the neighbour's yard, never to be seen again. And let's talk about roofing. Thatched roofs may look charming in historical dramas, but they were a menace after 3 months of snow and rain. They sagged, they leaked. Sometimes wildlife took up residence in them. Nothing says cozy evening like a squirrel falling into your soup. And when it rained, your floor turned into mud indoors, which meant your straw bed got soggy, your fire pit flooded, and your house began to smell like a compost pile in denial. Still, nothing compared to the constant war with cold air. The wind didn't just leak in, it kicked down the door and made itself comfortable. That's why the hearth wasn't just central to the home, it was the home's MVP. Your only weapon against the creeping cold was fire, and keeping that fire alive was a full-time job. Families developed elaborate systems for fire care. They passed down techniques for keeping embers smouldering through the night, like prized family recipes. Some swore by ash layering, others preferred letting the embers breathe. Everyone had an opinion, and they were all convinced yours was wrong. Fire banking was the name of the game. And it wasn't about saving money, it was about saving your life. Before going to sleep, peasants would carefully bury glowing embers in a mound of ash. This ash acted like insulation, keeping just enough heat alive to reignite in the morning. If you got it right, you'd wake up to a toasty glow. If you didn't, you'd wake up to your uncle swearing loudly while frantically striking flint over kindling and probably losing feeling in his toes. Even with good fire banking, backup plans were necessary. Families would take turns waking up at night to check the hearth, poke it back to life, and possibly chase off any curious animals that wandered too close. This medieval fire watch was the 2 a.m. equivalent of hitting the thermostat in modern life. Except the thermostat didn't bite. And when it got really cold, truly bone-shatteringly cold, everyone huddled together like a medieval lasagna. Entire families, plus assorted animals, would cram into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they owned. Babies in the center, elders on the inside, strong bodies on the outer edges, forming a human insulation sandwich. If you were on the edge, you prayed for spring and counted your toes every morning. Privacy? Never heard of her. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. If Aunt Maud snored, you lived with it. If the goat drooled on your sleeve, you were grateful for the warmth. And if your cousin kicked you into the draft during the night, well, you started plotting your revenge come spring. It wasn't just your family in the pile either. Animals joined in too. Chickens roosted in rafters, pigs snuggled near the fire, and cows, those glorious heat-producing beasts, were often granted front-row seats to the warmth. A cow in the kitchen wasn't a nuisance, it was a radiator with legs. And if you tripped over it during a midnight bathroom trip, that's just part of the fun. Speaking of bathrooms, there weren't any, not indoors anyway. And during winter, you had to make some difficult decisions, like, is it worth freezing my extremities for the sake of decency? Or should I just use the bucket and deal with judgmental looks in the morning? Some families even assigned fire-sitting shifts to the kids. If you were old enough to stand without falling into the hearth, you were old enough to keep it burning. This rite of passage taught responsibility, timing, and how to avoid burning down your house while half asleep. Ultimately, medieval winter survival came down to a mix of ingenuity, shared suffering, and the quiet hope that tomorrow wouldn't be worse. Everyone had a role to play: young, old, human, animal. If you had a heartbeat and a warm body, you were part of the system. So the next time you grumble about drafty windows or your heating bill, just remember your medieval ancestors kept warm by cramming themselves into a pile of relatives and livestock, all while praying the squirrel in the thatch didn't fall in again. Fashion in the medieval winter wasn't about turning heads, it was about not freezing off the ones you already had. If you're picturing peasants flipping through a ye old winter catalogue, deciding between goose-down parkas and fur-lined cloaks, let's pump the brakes. Most folks wore what they had, what they could find, or what they hadn't yet burned for fuel. The rule of thumb was simple: if you owned it, you wore it, all of it, at once. No mix and match coordination, no worrying about clashing wool tones, just layer upon layer until you either retained body heat or couldn't bend your arms, whichever came first. Start with a scratchy linen shirt that hadn't been washed since last harvest. Add a thicker tunic over that. Then another. Maybe a cloak that had once been a nobleman's, now repurposed and smelling like 12 goats. For the lucky few, there was sheepskin, heavy, lumpy, and often shedding in places you didn't expect. But if it kept the wind from turning your bones into popsicles, it was basically couture. As for trousers, let's just say medieval fashion didn't care much for waistlines. Most peasants wrapped themselves in layers of sagging fabric until they resembled walking bundles of firewood. Leggings made from old wool or burlap scraps were common, usually held up by faith and friction. Footwear was its own tragicomedy. Boots were rare. If you had them, they were probably wooden clogs or stitched leather things that let in more snow than they kept out. Most folks just wrapped their feet in rags and hoped for the best. If you had circulation problems, your toes were on a timer. But the real twist in medieval winter wear: dirt. That's right. Grime wasn't just a side effect of poverty. It was a strategy, a greasy, smoky, sheep-scented form of insulation. Clean clothes, ironically, were cold clothes. Freshly washed linen was breathable, great in summer, terrible in January. So peasants let nature do the work. Over time, as sweat, soot, and the general funk of daily life built up in the fabric, those layers became surprisingly wind-resistant. It was like a medieval puffer jacket, but with more texture. And smell. Lots of smell. Imagine if your jacket doubled as a smokehouse and a compost bin, and you've got the idea. Bathing was rare in winter, not because they didn't want to, but because the idea of stripping down next to a frozen stream sounded like a fast track to pneumonia. Plus, most people believed that bathing during the cold months could actually make you sick. The logic was, why risk your life for the privilege of being clean? Honestly, relatable. Soap existed, technically, but it was often saved for holy days or emergencies, maybe if the bishop was visiting, maybe if someone died. Most days the soap was either non-existent or so caustic it could take your skin with the dirt. So folks just leaned into the filth and called it protective layering. And it wasn't just clothing that got crusty. Hair, skin, fingernails, all part of the winter survival aesthetic. Children, wrapped in so many clothes they resembled walking turnips, would shuffle through their homes like tiny, itchy snowmen. By February, everyone had transformed into walking museums of sediment, each smudge a badge of endurance. Scarves, hats, and gloves were cherished like buried treasure. A wool cap could mean the difference between surviving the night and waking up with icicles forming in your eyebrows. Gloves were usually made from leftover scraps, bits of leather, old cloaks, or, if your household was especially thrifty, bits of shoe leather repurposed for your fingers. Were they stylish? Did they work? Sometimes. The peasant wardrobe wasn't elegant, but it was effective in its own tragic way. Your fashion sense took a back seat to not dying. You could be the best-dressed corpse in the village, but you'd still be a corpse. So they chose warmth over beauty. And if they looked like a heap of laundry that had wandered off and found sentience, so be it. And remember, nobody else smelled great either. Everyone was a bit earthy. After a few weeks, your nose stopped complaining. It either adjusted or gave up completely. Nose blindness became more of a life skill than a condition. If someone walked into your hut and didn't recoil, they were either family or had already lost their sense of smell. Meanwhile, fleas and lice didn't mind the cold. In fact, the cozy layers of wool and grime made for perfect winter condos. If you woke up scratching more than sleeping, congrats. You had the full peasant experience. A living ecosystem traveled with you everywhere. You weren't just surviving, you were hosting. That straw bedding everyone huddled into, perfect for bugs. It cradled warmth, yes, but it also cradled tiny roommates you didn't invite. Replacing it was a major ordeal, so people just kept piling fresh straw on top, like they were burying the sins of winters past. Eventually, the mattress was a 6-inch stack of mystery biology and good intentions. But all of this, the clothes, the dirt, the haystack of a bed, served one purpose: staying alive. Winter didn't care if you looked like you'd lost a fight with a wool merchant. It only cared how well you could endure, and if you came out of it with all your fingers and toes intact, you were basically royalty. Of course, if you had livestock, you weren't just fighting for your own survival, you were now running an indoor zoo. Chickens nested in rafters, goats lounged near the hearth, pigs sprawled wherever they pleased. Cows, being warm and vaguely majestic, were often given spots of honor. You learned quickly not to argue with a cow about seating arrangements. Every night became a test of patience and spatial awareness. One wrong turn, and you were stepping on a pig or waking up with a goat staring into your soul. Still, those animals gave off heat, and heat meant survival. So you didn't complain. You thanked the pig, apologized to the goat, and adjusted your straw bed for the 400th time. By the dead of winter, the entire household resembled a breathing, wheezing mass of wool, smoke, and animal fur. If it sounds grim, it was, but it was also a strange, shared kind of endurance. Families joked, sang, told stories, and occasionally cursed the wind in unison like a medieval chorus of discomfort. So, while your modern wardrobe might include thermal socks, down jackets, and electric blankets, just remember, your ancestors walked through sleet and snow wearing a goat-scented cloak and 17 layers of hope. And somehow they made it to spring. If you thought the medieval peasant's day was rough, wait until bedtime. Because when night fell, things got crunchy and itchy and slightly damp. For starters, the idea of a bedroom didn't really exist. Everyone slept in the same space they ate, cooked, stored tools, fed animals, and probably argued over turnips. Privacy was less of a right and more of a hilarious rumor. A bed, if you had one, was a wooden frame supporting a sack of straw, rushes, or whatever the dog hadn't claimed. There was no mattress, no blanket fort, no pillow top, anything. Instead, You had pokey plants in a burlap sack, the straw poked, the sack scratched. The entire arrangement smelled like it had ambitions to compost itself before spring. Those who couldn't afford even that luxury just dumped straw or rushes straight onto the dirt floor and called it a night. If you were lucky, someone had tossed in herbs like rosemary or lavender to mask the smell of mold, goats, and neighbor. Of course, those lovely scents lasted about a day. After that, your sleeping area smelled like a swampy casserole. Over time, the rushes flattened, rotted, and turned into a sticky mat of regrets. Cleaning it? Ha! That was a once or twice a year activity, maybe when the straw started to wiggle on its own. Instead, most folks just threw fresh rushes on top of the old ones, layering history like rings on a tree stump. Fleas and lice loved this setup. In fact, it was less a bed and more a thriving bug metropolis. If you got out of bed without 3 new bites and a mild rash, you were considered lucky. A good night's sleep wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. You curled up like a defensive armadillo, hoping your straw fort would hold until morning. And just when you thought the situation couldn't get cozier, enter everyone else. Medieval homes weren't spacious. So when night came, the whole household piled into whatever sleeping space existed. Parents, children, grandparents, and the occasional neighbor who just needed a place to crash. They all crammed in. Sleeping arrangements followed a loose logic. Babies and elderly folk went in the middle, where body heat radiated strongest. Everyone else took positions based on age, bulk, or proximity to livestock. If you found yourself on the outside edge, you were basically sleeping in a wind tunnel with extra snoring. That's not even mentioning the livestock. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, they all moved in for winter. Because animals give off heat. And also because someone had to cuddle the pig. Cows often took up spots near the hearth, mooing softly while chewing cud, like they were the true owners of the house. Goats would curl up wherever they pleased, often with an air of smug warmth. Chickens roosted above, sometimes on rafters, sometimes on things that weren't supposed to be chicken furniture. And pigs? Pigs didn't care. They'd plop down in the middle of the floor and snore louder than Grandpa. You didn't just sleep in a room, you shared a sleep ecosystem. There were sounds, smells, and the occasional unexpected hoof. You learned to ignore the oinks, clucks, and whatever your sibling muttered in their sleep. You also learned to tuck your cloak tightly, lest a draft or chicken tail sneak in. Speaking of drafts, those were relentless. Medieval homes were built with hope, prayer, and whatever materials could be dragged from the woods. The walls, made of sticks smeared with mud and dung, developed cracks faster than peasants developed blisters. Gaps in the walls let in cold like it had an invitation. To fight this, peasants used whatever was available. Moss was a favorite, easy to stuff into holes and vaguely fuzzy. Rags, wool scraps, straw clumps, old cloaks, even animal hair. If it filled a space and didn't scream, it was insulation. Some folks got bold and applied a new layer of mud and dung to their walls as a winter project. Imagine standing outside in the bitter cold, smearing manure onto your house and thinking, this is fine, this is luxury, because it kind of was. Every handful was a slap in the face to winter. Window holes weren't much better. Glass was ridiculously expensive. The lord of the manor might have one tiny pane, and he probably made guests look at it like a museum exhibit. For everyone else, they covered their windows with animal hide or thick cloth, ideally soaked in tallow. It blocked the wind and added a bonus aroma of meaty candle. Doors were barely better. A few planks hung with iron nails or wood pegs. If they didn't fall off, they creaked. If they didn't creak, they let in wind. and sometimes raccoons. Every night became a defensive campaign against the elements. You didn't go to bed, you took up a post. Peasants also got strategic with sleeping orientation. You didn't just sprawl anywhere. You angled yourself to maximize heat retention and minimize the number of limbs facing the wind. Sleeping in groups wasn't just warm, it was tactical. Stronger folks on the outside, fragile ones in the center. Pets curled up in laps and no one moved unless they wanted a chorus of complaints. And no, you couldn't just get up and wander around. Midnight bathroom trips were a team effort. You stepped on 3 people, 2 chickens, and probably kicked over a pig before reaching the bucket or the back door, whichever seemed more socially acceptable at 2 a.m. But even amid all this chaos, peasants kept a sense of humor. They cracked jokes, told stories, sang songs with more volume than pitch. Cold nights were made warmer by laughter, warmth by shared struggle. Your sibling might hog the cloak, and your dog might fart in your face, but it was your family, and that meant something. Every night survived was a little victory. Every morning with 10 toes and a working fire was cause for celebration. Maybe a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. Maybe just a deep, satisfied sigh as you looked around your crowded, smelly, noisy home and thought, we're still here? So the next time you snuggle into your memory foam mattress under your electric blanket, just know, your ancestors were huddled on straw piles next to cows, wearing everything they owned, and somehow, they laughed their way through it. Of all the medieval winter survival techniques, few were more sacred than maintaining the fire. The hearth wasn't just the warmest spot in the house, it was the house's heart-lungs and central nervous system. Letting it go out overnight? That wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal of everything your chattering teeth stood for. Most peasants didn't have fireplaces in the way we think of them today, no carved mantles or roaring hearths with brass pokers. They had a pit in the middle of the room, maybe ringed with rocks where fire sputtered and smoke did whatever it wanted. Chimneys, dream on. The smoke either found its own way out or slowly turned the inside of your house into a wood-fired meat smoker. You, of course, were the meat. And yet the smoke was a blessing in disguise. Sure, it shortened your lifespan by a decade or 2 and made your eyes water constantly, but it also helped with the bugs. Fleas, mites, and other tiny freeloaders hated the constant haze. You might not be able to breathe well, but you weren't scratching all night either. It was a trade-off medieval peasants made with a shrug and a wheeze. Keeping the fire alive overnight was an art. Enter the ancient and noble practice of fire banking. This had nothing to do with finance and everything to do with not dying. Before bed, you'd carefully bury the glowing coals in a mound of ash like tucking in a small, angry sun. Done properly, the coals would stay warm till morning, ready to roar back to life with just a little encouragement. Done poorly, and you woke up to a cold pit and the haunting realization that you now had to start a fire from scratch in the dark with frozen fingers. Families took this seriously. The ability to bank a fire properly was passed down like a secret family recipe, often with intense debates over whether dry ash was better than damp ash, or whether you should pack the coals tight or let them breathe. It was the medieval version of arguing about how to grill a steak, only the stakes were much higher, literally life or death. But even the best fire banking could be foiled by a gust of wind, a damp log, or an overly enthusiastic sheep tripping into the hearth. That's why night shifts were a thing, not for defense, not for parties, but for fire maintenance. Families took turns waking up to check the coals, add fuel, and whisper encouragement to the stubborn flames. It was basically a medieval version of tiptoeing down the hall to bump the thermostat. Children weren't exempt. If you were old enough to hold a stick without stabbing someone, you were old enough to tend the fire. Congratulations, Timmy. You're now the 3 a.m. Ember Guardian. Don't burn the house down again. Meanwhile, everyone else tried to sleep. Tried being the key word. Between fire shifts, snoring pigs, drafty walls, and your cousin kicking you in the shin every 10 minutes, a restful night's sleep was about as rare as a hot bath in January. But fire wasn't the only challenge. Breathing itself became a survival tactic. Because when the air inside your house is roughly the same temperature as a snowman's soul, sucking in a lungful of it is not recommended. Deep breathing, instant regret, open mouth breathing, a one-way ticket to pneumoniaville. So peasants learned the fine art of survival breathing. Small, shallow sips of air, always through the nose. The idea was to warm the air slightly before it hit your lungs, reducing the chance of catching your death from simply existing. It wasn't yoga, it was survival, a kind of frosty meditation where the mantra was, don't die, don't die, don't die. Some folks even slept with cloth wrapped around their faces, scarves, old shirts, sometimes even bits of their cloaks, anything to filter the cold. Sure, you woke up with damp fabric stuck to your mouth and the faint scent of goat in your nostrils, but it beat coughing up your spleen by sunrise. Kids were taught early to breathe the right way. Parents scolded them for panting like dogs indoors. Close your mouth or the cold will eat your lungs. It wasn't just an old wives' tale, it was one of the few defense mechanisms they had. Still, all the fire poking and fancy breathing wouldn't mean much on an empty stomach. And so medieval peasants embraced one of winter's most important survival strategies, eating like their lives depended on it. Because they did, calories were armor. The fuller your belly, the warmer your body stayed. Heavy meals acted like internal space heaters. The digestion process created body heat, slow, steady warmth from the inside out. So at the end of the day, everyone gathered around the pot for their dose of edible insulation. Meals were simple but substantial. Thick stews, oat porridge, dense rye bread, and the occasional root vegetable thrown in for spice. Turnips, onions, parsnips. They were winter's holy trinity. If you were lucky, a sliver of salted meat might make an appearance. If you were really lucky, it wasn't entirely bone. And let's not forget fat. Glorious, glorious fat. It burned slow, gave lasting energy, and kept you feeling like a furnace, even as the wind shrieked outside. A hunk of lard in your stew might not win any awards on a cooking show, but in medieval times, it was peak luxury. Children were encouraged, forced, to eat everything on their plates. You don't want turnips? Fine. Freeze to death. Your choice. It was guilt, survivalism, and tough love, all wrapped into one steaming bowl of beige food. And for dessert? Wild dreams. Because nothing sparks surreal, unsettling sleep quite like digesting 3 pounds of barley and pork fat on a straw mattress while sharing air with a goat. Of course, the problem with food is that it gets cold fast, and since reheating meant risking your sacred fire, people got inventive. Enter the hay box. Imagine a wooden crate stuffed with dry hay, nature's thermos. You'd cook a stew, place the pot inside the hay box, cover it, and let the hay's insulation keep it warm for hours. Was it high-tech? Was it genius? Absolutely. But hay wasn't just for stew. People soon realized that anything that held heat could help fight the cold. And so began the medieval tradition of heating rocks. That's right, rocks. You'd toss one into the fire until it was practically glowing, pull it out with tongs, wrap it in rags, and slide it under your bed. Heated rock therapy, 14th century style. Handled carefully, it radiated warmth for hours. Handled poorly, it set your bedding on fire. Either way, it beat nothing. A stone at your feet might not solve all your problems, but it could keep your toes from turning into medieval popsicles. These were the weapons in the peasants' arsenal. Not swords, not armor, just fire, food, hay, and a rock that hadn't cracked from heat stress. Every ember banked, every scarf tied across a face, every awkward dinner dream brought them one day closer to spring. So while modern folks have heated blankets and space heaters, remember your ancestors huddled next to flaming stones and marinated in stew, dreams. They didn't thrive, but they survived, and they did it with style. Sort of. If you ever wondered who got the VIP spot in a medieval peasant home, it wasn't the head of the household or the guest from out of town, it was whoever snagged a spot closest to the fire. Sleeping near the hearth was less about status and more about basic survival. If you were too far from the flames, you were basically camping with a ceiling. Fire placement mattered. Most hearths were central, but the heat didn't exactly radiate evenly. It was more of a narrow cone of warmth that aggressively favored the person sitting directly in front of it. Everyone else had to angle in like cold lizards on a sun-warmed rock. One side of your body would roast nicely, the other would remain insultingly frozen. Too close and you risked waking up to the smell of burning wool, or worse, a singed cloak and a smoky eyebrow. Too far and you might as well be outside arguing with the moon. So people became tactical, strategic, almost competitive. A good spot near the fire was worth shuffling, nudging, and occasionally elbowing your cousin for. Children, elderly relatives, and the sick got priority near the flames. Not because peasants were overly sentimental, but because it made logistical sense. Babies needed to be warm to survive, and grandparents knew how to keep a fire going without setting their own pants ablaze. Everyone else fanned out from there like human insulation padding. It was a delicate balance. The fire might have been the warmest thing in the house, but it was also a source of danger. Pets knew this too. Dogs would wedge themselves near the coals, tails dangerously close to ignition. Chickens often took roost on hearthstones, clucking sleepily like feathery sentinels of warmth. And cows? Cows basically claimed squatters' rights to the whole front row. Sleeping beside the fire wasn't peaceful either. There were sudden shifts in the logs, loud pops from burning sap, and the ever-present risk of someone rolling over too far and waking up to find their blanket on fire. Comfort was a luxury. Survival was the goal. Beyond the circle of heat, the rest of the room was a frozen theatre of rustling straw, muffled curses, and desperate rearrangements. Someone always moved too much, someone always snored, and someone always stepped on someone else during a midnight attempt to find the chamber pot or the door. And let's not sugarcoat it, the smell was complex. When you cram half your family, 4 animals, and a stew pot into a single room and seal it off from the world, you don't get fresh alpine breeze. You get a cocktail of smoke, sweat, unwashed wool, animal funk, and faintly sour rushes. It was sensory warfare, but your nose eventually gave up and got with the program. By the time spring arrived, your clothes could probably stand up on their own. Your straw bed had developed an ecosystem, and your dog smelled suspiciously like cheese. But hey, you made it. But medieval winter wasn't just fought inside your own 4 wobbling walls. Survival was a community effort, a neighborhood pact. If your fire went out and you couldn't get it restarted, you didn't just sit there shivering. You leaned on your neighbors, literally and figuratively. In villages where everyone's home was essentially a poorly sealed smoke box, people kept an eye out for one another. If old Tom's chimney stopped puffing, someone would knock. Not just out of kindness, but because a dead neighbor meant one less pair of hands in the spring. Also, Tom might owe you eggs. Communal support wasn't optional. It was the unspoken law of winter. If a fire died out A neighbor might run over with a hot coal wrapped in cloth or carried in a chunk of hollowed-out wood. A glowing ember could save your life. Sharing fire was the medieval equivalent of jump-starting a car, minus the cables and plus a risk of mild third-degree burns. People even took note of who was coughing too much, who hadn't shown up at the communal oven, or whose door hadn't opened in 2 days. The sick were checked on, the elderly were watched over. Even the grumpiest villager got a knock and a bowl of hot gruel when things got rough. Children were often the messengers, sprinting across frozen paths to deliver kindling, soup, or warnings. Ma says your chimney's dark, and Pa says he saw your goat in our shed again. Urgent errands, medieval style. And sometimes desperate times called for desperate hospitality. Families would squeeze in another household for the night, cramming more bodies into already packed homes because 2 fires are better than 1 was a matter of fact, not just philosophy. Sure, you'd lose a bit of floor space and the stew would have fewer turnips to go around, but nobody froze alone if the village could help it. It wasn't always sunshine and community hugs, though. Feuds happened. Someone always borrowed a cloak and forgot to return it. Goats mysteriously vanished and reappeared suspiciously fattened in a rival's yard. People held grudges like heirlooms, but winter had a way of putting even the most ridiculous squabbles on pause, because when the wind screamed like banshees and snow piled up against the door, your worst enemy was still better than the cold. Even the most stubborn villager would shove over and make space near the fire if it meant keeping toes attached. Those communal meals? They were never lavish. Maybe a pot of barley, a couple carrots, and a bone that had seen better days. But they kept the flame of humanity alive, alongside whatever firewood you could beg, borrow, or scavenge. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine medieval folk sitting serenely by the fire, reading illuminated manuscripts and sipping broth. In reality, they were elbowing goats, adjusting smelly cloaks, dodging falling chickens, and hoping their neighbor remembered to bring back the ember they borrowed yesterday. And yet, through all that chaos, something beautiful endured. Laughter, stories, songs, shared discomfort gave way to shared resilience. Children learned not just how to survive, but how to do it together, with muddy boots, frozen noses, and a pig snoring by the hearth. So the next time your neighbor's music is too loud, or you grumble about someone parking too close to your driveway, consider this. In the dead of medieval winter, that neighbor might have been the reason your house stayed warm, or your turnips didn't get stolen, or your toes didn't fall off. Community wasn't just nice, it was everything, one ember at a time. Even with all the grit, all the fire tending, all the awkward sleeping arrangements and goat-based heat strategies, sometimes it still wasn't enough. Sometimes winter won. And when it did, it didn't announce itself with flair. It crept in quietly, like a frost-bitten whisper. A family who failed to restart the fire, a roof that gave out under the weight of too much snow, a cough that started soft and ended in silence. Winter didn't just take the unprepared, it took the unlucky, the tired, sometimes even the strong. There were years so brutal that entire households disappeared. When spring came and the thaw revealed more than just muddy paths, sometimes it revealed stories frozen in time. Families found huddled together, arms wrapped tight, as if they could squeeze just one more degree of warmth out of each other. And in a way they did. They didn't die alone, they died trying, together. In the harshest winters, the village records would thin. Graves would outnumber births, and stories would ripple across markets and firesides for generations. "Remember the cold of 15? They'd whisper, shivering not just from chill but from memory. Some winters were so cruel that hope became a luxury. The Great Famine of 1315, for instance, brought endless rain, crop failure, and a chill that clung to bones. Livestock perished. Fields turned to sludge. Hunger gnawed louder than the wind. People spoke in hushed tones of bark stew, of shoe leather boiled soft, of darker things. Things said only once and never repeated. But even in the darkest moments, embers glowed, because the most astonishing thing wasn't the cold, it was the people who endured it, who stood up every morning, numb, dirty, half-starved, and said, "Let's try again." And when spring finally came, it wasn't with a trumpet or a rainbow. It started with small things, the drip of melting ice from the eaves, the first green shoot poking stubbornly through the mud, the whisper of birdsong. You didn't cheer, you held your breath, you waited, you hoped it wasn't a trick. The thaw was slow, so slow. But when it arrived, really arrived, it felt like the world exhaling. Children ran barefoot again. Doors stayed open longer, clothes were washed in the stream, and people remembered what their neighbors looked like beneath layers of grime and fur. The goat smell faded, laughter came easier, and still they remembered. The cold wasn't just a threat, it was a teacher. Every crack patched with moss, every ember banked in ash, every bowl of stew shared in the candlelit dark. It all built something, a kind of quiet defiance. Because that's the real legacy of the medieval winter, not just survival, but transformation. It turned ordinary people into legends of resilience. It shaped communities that knew how to share, how to sacrifice, how to carry each other when the wind howled loudest. These were people who had no central heating, no insulated walls, no electric blankets, only mud, fire, dirt, and each other. And with that they built generations. They raised children, buried parents, told stories that danced on smoky hearths and lived beyond their own lifetimes. So when you settle into your soft bed tonight, when you grumble about the thermostat or sip something hot without thinking twice, remember them. The frostbitten fighters, the ones who didn't have the luxury to quit, who faced down a season bent on breaking them and whispered, "Not today." Their blood runs in your veins, their breath carried your name before you ever existed. And every warm spring, every blooming field, every sunbeam through your window is something they earned for you, one shivering night at a time. They may not have had titles or fame. No songs were written, no statues raised. But they were giants. Not because they stood tall, but because they knelt in the cold over and over and rose anyway. And in that rising, mud-caked, soot-covered, eyes squinting against the wind, they gave us more than stories. They gave us proof that humanity can endure anything, one ember, one meal, one stubborn, frostbitten heartbeat at a time. Let's say you wake up in a medieval hovel. Not a cottage, not a hut. A hovel. A structure held together by mould, fear, and maybe 3 nails. You wake up because someone sneezed directly into your hair and the pig is snoring louder than your grandfather. The roof? Leaking, the walls, breathing, the air, thick with the aroma of unwashed wool, onion soup, and goat. That's the good corner. The bad corner has a mysterious puddle and something growing out of the straw that you've named Bernard and now fear. You don't so much get out of bed as peel yourself off it. Your blanket is burlap. Your pillow is a sack of old peas. Your mattress is straw that's been compacted into a prickly slab of misery and dreams you don't talk about. You're covered in a light crust of soot, crumbs, and last night's stew. Morning chores begin immediately. First, you check the fire. It's out. Of course. So now you get to kneel in last month's ash, blow into a pile of frozen charcoal, and hope you don't pass out from smoke inhalation before it catches you burn your sleeve again. Then it's off to the animals. They live inside with you because it's warmer. Not warm, just less dead. The chickens have laid exactly one egg on your only clean shirt. The goat chewed through your bootlace. The cow has sat on the bucket again. Breakfast is whatever you can find that isn't nailed down or actively moving. A crust of bread. Cold porridge that has formed a skin tougher than your actual skin. A mug of something that might have once been ale but now smells like despair. Your teeth hurt, not a tooth. All of them. You suck on a mint leaf and hope for the best. Then it's time to fetch water. You walk a mile to the stream with 2 wooden buckets that leak. It's uphill both ways somehow. You slip in the mud. You curse. The water is cold. The buckets are heavy. You get home and spill half of it on your own feet. They freeze instantly. Work in the field is backbreaking. The soil is made of rocks and heartbreak. Your plough is a stick tied to a more stubborn stick. The ox refuses to move unless insulted in 3 languages. You try Latin. Nothing. You dig. You hoe. You get dirt in places you didn't know existed. Your neighbor walks by and accuses your cabbage of witchcraft. Again, you throw a turnip at him. He throws one back. It's the closest thing to community engagement you've had in months. Lunch is a ladle of soup. Thin, grey, suspicious. You chew it somehow. You tell yourself it's meat. You know it's probably moss. Someone drops their bowl. Everyone screams like they just lost the king's crown. That was the good bowl. Afternoon brings more chores. Firewood, always firewood. You chop it with an axe that's more rust than blade. The wood is damp. Your fingers go numb. A splinter the size of a javelin lodges in your palm. You pull it out with your teeth. By evening, the wind has found new ways to enter the house. It howls like it's got a vendetta. You stuff the holes with straw, rags, and what's left of your dignity. The door slams open 3 times. Once it was the wind, once a goat, once your neighbor just walking in to stare silently and leave. Dinner is the same as lunch, but colder and sadder. You huddle by the hearth, which now smokes indoors instead of up. Your eyes water. The goat farts. You wonder how anyone survived long enough to invent the lute. Bedtime is a group activity. 10 bodies, 5 blankets, and 1 fire. Everyone is praying doesn't go out. Someone snores, someone coughs, someone rolls onto your face. You lay awake thinking about what it would feel like to own a second pair of socks, and yet you survive. Not gracefully, not comfortably, but with just enough stubbornness to do it all again tomorrow. You dream of shoes without holes, of cloaks that don't smell like cheese, of a roof that doesn't drop icy rainwater directly onto your pillow, which, to be clear, is just a rolled-up tunic that once belonged to someone named Bartholomew who disappeared last winter. Your dreams are interrupted when someone wakes you to tell you it's your turn to check the fire. The coals are almost out. You blow gently, whisper threats, offer promises. You toss in a dry twig and beg like it's royalty. The flame flickers. You win, for now. In the morning, your joints creak like an old wagon wheel. Your back is furious. Your knees won't bend properly. But the chickens need chasing again. The last time they got out, they invaded the baker's hut and traumatized a visiting friar. Breakfast? You find a crust of something on the windowsill. You sniff it. It doesn't move. That's good enough. Someone offers you porridge, which is a strong word for what looks like beige sadness in a bowl. You accept. Hunger is persuasive. Midday means community duties. You help repair a fence that's held together with string, curses, and wishful thinking. The children are screaming again, either at each other or at the rat that's learned to open doors. You can't tell anymore. Someone is getting married. The whole village is invited, which means everyone stands in a field and watches two people promise not to die alone. There's music, if you count someone blowing into a jug and a boy hitting a bucket with a spoon. There's food, bread, broth, and a pie so hard it's classified as a weapon. You dance. Badly. But who's judging? No one has clean socks. That night, there's a feast, 3 turnips and a parsnip carved into a swan. It's the most luxurious thing you've seen in months. A travelling bard sings a song about a heroic sheep. No one knows why. The goat eats part of his cloak. He keeps singing. Back at home, your bed feels less like a bed and more like a test of endurance. You lie down. The straw pokes you in new ways. You hear something skitter under the floor. You pretend it's just the wind. You fall asleep thinking about soup. The next day is market day, which means dragging a cart with one working wheel across roads that are 70% mud, 20% rocks, and 10% something you'd rather not identify. You trade eggs for onions, onions for cloth, cloth for a half-rotten apple, and the apple for a shoe sole that smells like ambition. On the way back, it rains, because of course it does. Your cart tips, you curse the heavens, the mud, and the ox who clearly resents you. A passing monk blesses you. You grumble something about blessed boots and trudge home wetter than a pond fish with regrets. Back in the village, your neighbour is yelling about witches again. No one listens. He's been yelling about witches ever since his goat gave birth to a one-eared kid that looks suspiciously like him. Dinner is whatever didn't fall out of the cart. You sit by the fire, wrap yourself in a blanket that's more holes than fabric, and sip from a wooden cup that's been gnawed on by something with small teeth and bad intentions. As you drift off, someone sneezes into your sock. You sigh and roll over. Just another night in paradise. But here's the thing no one says out loud. For all the filth, the smoke, the relentless draft trying to assassinate your spine, there's still something weirdly alive about it. Not beautiful, not poetic, but real. You know the sound of your neighbour's laugh, the smell of wet bread, the exact weight of a frozen chamber pot in the dark. You know which herbs help with headaches and which ones definitely don't. You know how to keep a fire alive with nothing but hope, twigs, and the occasional scream. You know how to survive when everything, absolutely everything, is working against you. And somehow, through blizzards, bugs, and burnt soup, you keep doing it. Welcome to medieval life. You are still here, my friend? I can't believe it. This didn't help you fall asleep? Well, I will try harder in the next one to achieve that. You deserve a gold star. You are a trooper. Type gold star in the comments below, and we'll know you made it to the end. I'm sure not many did. Good night, my friend, and thanks again for tuning in.